He was a brilliant man.
He was an idealist. This was a man who believed in
He was an extraordinary man. In person, the man was peerless.
He was a legislative genius.
His ingenious creativity and utter determination paved his way to leadership. His leadership skills left a massive legacy. He influenced the laws, rights, organizations, and structures that would build up modern America.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I can tell you it's where. Yeah, I would think so.
We have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society.
Lyndon B. Johnson had been thinking of ideas, and once he had the power, he knew what he could accomplish. He released a whirlwind of new laws that would build up the new America, the Great Society. But most important were his War on Poverty and his Civil Rights Act. On July 2nd, 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. It was one of the biggest landmarks in civil rights history in the United States. It ended unfair voting requirements, and it ended racial segregation practices. Johnson then wanted to pass the Voting Rights Act. He had a brilliant idea. He called Martin Luther King and told him to find the worst possible place to hold a protest, and to protest there about voting, so that maybe some people would realize it's unfair. So King chose Selma. On March 7th, 1965, 600 marchers assembled in Selma, Alabama. They found their way blocked by Alabama state troopers and local police who ordered them to turn around. When the protesters refused, the officers shot tear gas and waded into the crowd, beating the nonviolent protesters with billy clubs and ultimately hospitalizing over 50 people. This event would become known as Bloody Sunday. Then Johnson gave one of his most important and valued speeches of all time.
But really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Then the Voting Rights Act was passed, ending all segregation in voting and creating the Community Relations Service to help communities cope with racial tensions coming from voting and schooling changes. Johnson then pushed for a law that would stop separating races into different areas. He saw that different races would be shown different houses by real estate agents, so that all the Negroes would stay in one area and all the whites in another, and on and on. He would call this the Fair Housing Act. Then Martin Luther King died. The famous peaceful civil rights activist was assassinated. Johnson pushed for the Fair Housing Act and it passed. Johnson used this tragedy to convince America that this bill had to be passed, and it did. Johnson had succeeded in maneuvering multiple laws through Congress to end segregation and discrimination in America.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
Johnson would be the president who would aim to eradicate poverty and to cut it to its roots. And so the Economic Opportunity Act was passed. This created an anti-poverty coordination and started many programs, such as Head Start, Jobs Corps, Upward Bound, Work Experience, Youth Corps, and college loan programs. Then, on August 21st, 1964, the Food Stamp Act created the first permanent national food assistance program to aid the war on poverty. After that, Johnson signed the first Social Security Act with a Medicaid program, having the first priority on the low-income children to further aid in the war on poverty. the war continued. On August 10, 1965, the passage of the Housing and Urban Development Act created the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and set out some of the first housing assistance programs for the poor. Then the Higher Education Act started the Basic Economic Opportunity Grants and guaranteed student loans. It also created the Federal Talent Search Program to help students in poverty become college ready. After that, the minimum wage was increased from $1.25 an hour to $1.60 an hour. The Child Nutrition Act greatly expanded the federal school lunch program and created the school breakfast program for low-income students. In the following years, many more laws were made, each one building up to create the Great Society. Johnson was a great leader because he was passionate about everything he did. He was not pushing the laws for his personal gain to ensure his success in wealth, but he cared about the American people. In 1927, Johnson taught in a Mexican-American school in South Texas in the town of Cotulla. There he experienced poverty and pitied the children living there. They had already experienced the pain of segregation. There was a school for whites close to the Mexican-American school, and his students were segregated and discriminated. He felt their pain and wanted to help them. When he became president, one of the first things he did was to declare a war on poverty. He did this because he was moved by his time in the school in Cotulla. Johnson once said, knowing then that college was closed to practically every one of those children because they were too poor. And I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American. The fact that the children were too poor to afford an education prompted the Primary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, guaranteed student loans for getting into college, and much more. Almost everything he made a law upon was sparked by personal experience and deep passion to make things better and fairer for the American people. Lyndon B. Johnson pushed for more laws than most other presidents. He was a great leader and had many ideas. He told others his ideas and accomplished them to the good of America. He was a good communicator. He would often hold meetings at different places, in the pool, the bowling alley, and more. He had a phone wherever he could possibly have one, so he could communicate his ideas at any time. He even had a phone in the restroom. He was also a good leader because he did not do things for personal gain. He did everything because he was passionate about ending poverty and creating civil rights. He was known for the Johnson treatment. He would breathe in your face and make an immense figure of himself while telling you that you would do something. He did not ask if you wanted to do something. He said, "You will do this." He had some good aspects of a leader. He was brilliant, diligent, hardworking, and he communicated well. He always thought vigorously before he did anything. He practically dragged America into the Great Society. Then there was the war in Vietnam. It was a stalemate. The Americans could not win without killing millions of civilians. This was one of the problems Johnson did not think he could solve. This was the bad side of his legacy. He did not run for president again. But instead of running for president, he decided to focus all his intentions on stopping the war.
I have lived out the promise of LBJ's efforts because Michelle has lived out the legacy.
Johnson made a huge contribution to America with the Great Society. His massive amounts of laws added up to America's better future. The war on poverty was successful. Poverty rates overall dropped significantly during his term. Since 1965, the federal government has provided more than $250 billion in 86 million college loans to 29 million students, and more than $14 billion in work and study awards to 6 million students. Today, nearly 60% of full-time undergraduate students receive federal financial aid under Great Society programs. In 1963, most elderly Americans had no health insurance. The poor had little access to medical treatment. Since 1965, 79 million Americans have signed up for Medicare. The Great Society's food stamp program helps feed more than 29 million people in more than 8 million households. The school breakfast program has provided daily breakfast to nearly 100 million school children. The life expectancy rate went up too. Infant deaths had almost a 75% decrease. Johnson's Beautification Acts made America clean and beautiful. Most importantly, Lyndon B. Johnson ended segregation. This did not only help socially and politically, but the life expectancy of African Americans went up. In numbers of Americans affected, the Great Society exceeds in domestic impact even the New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society made a lasting impact and legacy on millions of Americans to this day.